I'm Claire, 27, and I live in the old Victorian house my grandparents built at the edge of a quiet tree-lined street. The place has been in our family for generations, a brick and timber reminder of everything stable in a neighborhood that keeps changing. My parents travel a lot, so I've been the one paying the utility bills, arranging repairs, and keeping the big garden alive. 2 months ago, I spent nearly every spare dollar fixing a sagging section of the roof and planting a fresh round of perennials along the front path. The garden finally looks the way I imagined, a mix of native flowers and carefully shaped hedges that frame the porch in color. I made those improvements because my parents always told me I could stay as long as I wanted, that this house would always be a safe place. One Wednesday evening, I came home from a long day at the landscape office and found a glossy stack of real estate brochures spread across the dining table. Photos of modern downtown condos stared back at me, all glass and steel. The top one had a handwritten note clipped to it. Appointment with agent Friday, 3 p.m. I stared at it for a long minute, convinced it had to be for someone else. That night, over dinner, my parents dropped their plan as if it were nothing. They talked about selling the house, said they wanted to simplify and enjoy a city lifestyle. They spoke about it like they were discussing a vacation, not the home I maintain and love. I offered to sign a lease and pay rent, but they brushed it off with a casual "too complicated" and moved on to talk about their next trip. The next morning, I stepped outside to water the garden and met Mrs. Dalton, who runs the neighborhood watch. She noticed the papers in my hand and asked if we were selling. When I explained, her face tightened. She said a developer had been sniffing around the area, buying old houses to tear down for multi-unit apartments. She also mentioned that some of the homes here might qualify for historic preservation if someone applied. I walked through the garden later, phone in hand, taking photos of every corner I'd restored. The idea of someone ripping out these old maples or replacing the stained glass windows made my stomach twist. I sent a message to Mara, my closest friend since college and a paralegal who knows her way around property law. She called back right away and told me to start gathering every receipt for repairs and every bank transfer I'd made to keep the place running. That weekend, a few neighbors dropped by to see the progress in the yard. I mentioned the possible sale and watched their expressions harden. Mr. Ruiz from across the street suggested reaching out to the Historical Preservation Board. Mrs. Dalton offered to introduce me to a council member who cared about protecting older homes. Someone else proposed turning the upcoming Spring Garden Festival into a rallying point to show off the house's character. While everyone shared ideas, I overheard my parents on a phone call in the next room. My mother was laughing about a luxury condo with a skyline view, not a simpler life like they'd told me. That detail changed everything. If this wasn't about downsizing, it was about trading up and leaving me to scramble. I spent that night on my laptop, reading city ordinances. I found a section describing how a pending landmark application could temporarily block any sale or demolition. It would mean paperwork, inspections, and a lot of community support, but it was possible. I printed every guideline, highlighting deadlines and required evidence. By Sunday evening, the plan started to take shape. I organized a folder with receipts for the roof repair, garden expenses, and monthly utilities I'd been paying. I copied the real estate brochures and the note about the agent's appointment. I saved text messages from my parents where they acknowledged my financial help over the years. At dinner, my parents made another casual comment about meeting the realtor. I asked again if we could work out a rental agreement. They dismissed the idea, saying it would scare off buyers. My father said, "You're too attached to this place," as if caring about the home was a flaw. I didn't argue. Instead, I quietly placed my folder of evidence back into my bag and started making a list of neighbors to contact. Mrs. Dalton came over later with the phone number for someone on the preservation board. She said the community garden team would back me if I needed signatures or letters. Mara texted to remind me to document every conversation and to keep everything in writing. I walked the block as the sun set, noticing the ribbons neighbors had tied to their mailboxes for the upcoming festival. The street smelled of lilacs and fresh soil. It struck me how much history was held in these houses, in the gardens that stretched toward the sidewalks. By the end of the weekend, I had a strategy. Contact the preservation board first thing Monday, involve supportive neighbors, and prepare every document to prove my role in maintaining the property. My parents might think this is just another house, but it isn't. It's a piece of the neighborhood's story, and I wasn't about to let it be sold off without a fight. The next Saturday morning, the gardening club gathered in my backyard for our regular meeting. Tables were covered with seedlings, and the air smelled of damp soil and coffee. We had just started discussing plans for the spring festival when a silver sedan rolled up and parked half on the curb. A man in a navy suit stepped out, carrying a clipboard and a laser measuring device. Without even knocking, he walked straight toward the porch and began taking notes on the exterior trim. Everyone turned to look. I walked over, still holding a trowel, and asked what he was doing. He introduced himself as a real estate agent and said he was there for the scheduled appraisal. I hadn't scheduled anything. Neighbors exchanged glances as he began snapping photos of the porch railings. When I told him I wasn't aware of an appointment, he checked his phone and said my parents had confirmed it earlier in the week. The timing couldn't have been worse for my parents. Word spread quickly among the gardening club members. Mrs. Dalton whispered to a friend, and within minutes phones were out, texts flying to other neighbors. The agent looked increasingly uncomfortable as curious residents arrived from next door, drawn by the unexpected visit. After he left, the club members stayed longer than usual, discussing what they'd seen. People who hadn't planned to attend the festival promised to show up now. The sudden appraisal had turned a quiet morning into neighborhood news. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a stack of documents. City records were easier to search than I expected. Within an hour, I found the property's construction date, over 100 years old, and an architectural classification that met the requirements for historic landmark status. I bookmarked every relevant ordinance and downloaded the application guidelines. By midnight, I had drafted an email to the city's preservation board. I explained the house's history and attached photographs of its original stained glass windows and the unique garden layout. I requested a preliminary inspection and hit send before I could overthink it. Less than an hour later, an auto reply confirmed a site visit within the week. Sunday afternoon, my parents returned from a weekend trip. I showed them the email confirmation and explained what the inspection meant. My mother's jaw tightened while my father flipped through the printed guidelines without a word. I said a landmark application would delay any sale until the board made a decision. My mother finally looked up and said the house was theirs to sell and no city board would change that. I called Mara and told her everything. By Monday morning, she had pulled tenant rights statutes and sent me a list of documents to gather. She explained that my steady financial contributions for utilities, repairs, and property maintenance could establish an implied tenancy. It wasn't a guaranteed shield against eviction, but it gave me legal standing. That same day, I began collecting support. Mrs. Dalton and Mr. Rui stopped by after work with handwritten letters endorsing historic status. By Tuesday evening, I had a small stack of signed statements from neighbors describing the house's role in community events and the unique architecture that deserved protection. Wednesday afternoon, while I was reviewing receipts, a courier arrived with a large envelope addressed to me. Inside was a formal notice from my parents demanding that I vacate the property within 30 days. They described me as a guest with no rights to stay beyond their permission. The letter was signed by both of them and notarized. I read it twice, then placed it in the evidence folder with the rest of my documents. I spent that night photographing every repair bill and scanning digital copies of bank transfers for utilities and contractor payments. I labeled each file with dates and amounts, creating a timeline that showed years of financial involvement. 2 days later, I attended the monthly neighborhood association meeting at the community center. The room was packed, partly because of the gossip about the unannounced appraisal. When it was my turn to speak, I explained the risk of a developer buying the property and demolishing the house. Heads nodded around the room as I shared the news of the pending preservation inspection. Several neighbors volunteered to gather additional signatures for a petition. The Spring Garden Festival became a key topic. Normally a small event, it now turned into a showcase to highlight the house's character and history. Local bakers promised to donate pastries, and a local band offered to play for free. Plans for banners, guided tours, and photo displays came together quickly. Later that week, while checking emails, I received a message from a retired city planner named Harold, who had heard about the meeting. He offered to help with the application and said he still had contacts on the city council who cared about preservation. We arranged to meet the next day at a coffee shop to go over the paperwork. Meanwhile, my parents had gone nearly silent. Messages from my father arrived as short texts about mail or minor maintenance questions, nothing more. My mother didn't call at all. I saved every message in a separate folder, as Mara suggested, keeping a careful record of their limited communication. Over the weekend, neighbors began tying green ribbons to their mailboxes with small tags that read "Save Our Street." Walking down the block, I counted more than 20 ribbons fluttering in the breeze. It sent a clear message that the neighborhood was united. A local blogger who covers community events stopped by to photograph the ribbons and asked a few questions about the preservation effort. The next morning, her post went live, complete with pictures of the house and garden. Comments flooded in from readers who valued historic homes and wanted to attend the festival. By the end of that week, the momentum felt unstoppable. Letters of support filled a growing folder on my desk. Harold introduced me to a council member who promised to attend the festival and speak to the preservation board on our behalf. Mara prepared a formal tenant rights notice to respond to the eviction demand, citing the pending historic application and my documented financial role. I walked through the garden one evening as the sun set, passing neighbors who waved from their porches. The ribbons fluttered like small flags of support. What had started as a surprise visit from an appraiser had become a neighborhood movement. Every new letter, every ribbon, every promise of help added weight to the effort to protect the house. The inspection appointment was set for the following week. I double-checked the folder with every receipt, photograph, and signature. The community was behind me, the legal groundwork was forming, and the city's process was officially in motion. Whatever my parents planned next, the house was no longer just a private decision. It had become a shared fight, and the first battle had already begun. The preservation inspector arrived early on a bright Tuesday morning, clipboard in hand and a camera hanging from her neck. She introduced herself quickly, then started photographing the stained glass windows, carved wood trim, and original brickwork. Neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalk watched as she walked the entire property line, noting details about the porch columns and the century-old maple trees. She lingered in the garden, pointing out how the layout matched early 1900s landscape designs and taking extra photos of the stone paths and antique iron gate. While the inspector moved from the front porch to the side yard, my parents pulled into the driveway. They stepped out, looking surprised to see the small crowd and the city official. My mother walked directly to the inspector and asked her to leave until the owners could be present for a scheduled visit. The inspector remained calm and explained that the preliminary review allowed her to document visible exterior elements from public areas, and that I had provided access to the garden with full consent. My parents exchanged a look but stayed silent as the inspector finished her work, jotting notes and snapping final pictures. As the inspector left, neighbors thanked her for coming and shared that the community valued the home. The supportive chatter carried across the street, a quiet but clear message that people were paying attention. That afternoon, the neighborhood blogger, who had first posted about the green ribbons, returned with a camera and a notepad. She asked for an update on the inspection and took new photos of the growing petition list. Later that evening, she published another post, and this time the story caught the eye of a local newspaper editor. The next morning, when I opened the door to pick up the paper, the headline across the front page read, "Neighbors Unite to Protect Historic Home from Sale." A large color photo of the house and garden filled the center of the page. The article detailed the surprise appraisal, the pending preservation review, and the community's growing involvement. By noon, residents were stopping by to show me the article, and people I didn't even know from other blocks offered help or signatures for the petition. The article reached my parents as well. By late afternoon, I received a brief text from my mother accusing me of dragging the family name into public drama. She wrote that the story embarrassed them and made them look careless with their own property. I hadn't contacted any reporter, but the explanation didn't matter. Harold, the retired city planner, called to say that the publicity might actually speed the process. He set up a meeting with a city council member who supported preservation efforts and could push the board to move quickly. We met the council member 2 days later at a neighborhood cafe, and she promised to speak directly with the preservation board chair about prioritizing the application. Meanwhile, Mara prepared a formal petition for protective status. She filed it with the city clerk, which triggered an automatic temporary hold on any sale or demolition until the preservation board reached a decision. We attached proof of my financial contributions and letters from neighbors as supporting evidence. Later that week, my parents called, threatening to stop contributing to property taxes if I continued with the petition. I reminded them that I had been covering the utilities and routine expenses for years, and that the property taxes were already paid from the shared household account, which I regularly funded. The conversation ended without resolution, but the threat didn't change the legal hold already in place. The neighborhood petition grew rapidly. Over the next few days, more than 50 households added their signatures. People left handwritten notes describing the street's history and the importance of keeping the Victorian homes intact. Some even attached old photographs showing past community gatherings in the garden. As the spring festival approached, excitement built. The green ribbons multiplied, and volunteers planned booths for homemade food, live music, and guided tours of other historic properties nearby. Local businesses donated supplies, and a printing shop offered free banners. Flyers with the headline from the newspaper article appeared in cafe windows and on notice boards at the community center. I focused on strengthening the preservation case. With Mara's advice, I organized small work crews to handle visible exterior improvements. Neighbors joined me to repaint the front steps, polish the brass fixtures, and replant a section of the flower beds that had thinned after the winter frost. The house looked vibrant and well cared for, a clear sign that it remained a living part of the neighborhood. While we worked, longtime residents shared stories of past attempts by developers to buy up old properties. One neighbor described how a developer had tried to purchase his own home 10 years ago, promising to keep it intact, but later filing plans for an apartment complex. Those experiences gave us useful talking points for the preservation board and reinforced the urgency of the petition. The tension with my parents grew more complicated. My father stopped by late one evening to pick up some mail and stayed longer than usual, walking through the garden and asking questions about the petition. He didn't voice direct support, but he admitted the community's commitment was impressive and that the house held more history than he had realized. My mother, on the other hand, remained firm in wanting the sale and avoided visiting altogether. One morning, the city's preservation office posted an official notice on the front gate. Pending historic landmark status, review in progress. The bold lettering caught the attention of every passerby. Neighbors gathered to take pictures and congratulated me on the progress. The sign served as both a legal statement and a rallying symbol for the festival, which was now only a week away. I spent the next few days compiling a complete record of every improvement I had made. I printed photographs of the new roof, detailed the costs of the garden restoration, and created a timeline of utilities and maintenance expenses I had covered. I organized everything into labeled binders, financial records, community letters, photographs, and legal filings. Mara reviewed each section to ensure nothing was missing for the upcoming hearing. By the weekend, the house stood out even more. The freshly painted steps gleamed, the garden overflowed with early blooms, and the new notice on the gate drew steady attention. Cars slowed as people stopped to read it, and neighbors waved when they passed. The story had spread beyond our block, drawing visitors who wanted to see the house that had sparked such a strong neighborhood movement. Every evening, as volunteers came and went, I felt the momentum growing. The festival planning committee finalized the schedule, arranged music, and confirmed that the city council member would attend. Mara secured extra copies of the petition for visitors to sign during the event. Harold coordinated with the preservation board to make sure the hearing date would be announced soon after the festival. The effort no longer felt like just my own fight. It had become a collective action supported by dozens of families and city officials. With the inspection complete, the petition filed, and the temporary protection in place, the house was closer than ever to official landmark status. The next step would be the festival itself, where the neighborhood planned to show the city exactly why this home, and the street around it, deserved to remain untouched for generations. The Spring Garden Festival opened under a clear sky and mild breeze, the kind of weather that draws everyone outside. By mid-morning, the street in front of the house overflowed with visitors. Cars lined both ends of the block while families walked in groups, carrying tote bags and cameras. Green Save Our Street ribbons fluttered from every mailbox and lamppost, and a banner stretched across the gate welcoming people to the historic garden. Local cafes had set up tables along the sidewalk, offering trays of pastries and steaming coffee urns. The scent of fresh bread and flowers mixed in the air. A small folk band played upbeat tunes near the front steps, drawing even more passers-by. Volunteers from the gardening club handed out maps showing different features of the property, architectural highlights, century-old trees, and original stonework in the garden paths. City officials arrived just after 10. The council member who had promised her support walked through the gate with 2 members of the preservation board. Cameras flashed as neighbors greeted them with applause. They moved slowly along the garden path, pausing to examine the antique wrought iron benches and the carved wooden porch columns. When they reached the main gathering space, the council member thanked the crowd for demonstrating how much a community can accomplish when it values its history. The preservation board members nodded, taking notes and snapping photos of the packed yard. Local business owners joined in the celebration. The bakery from down the street donated baskets of muffins and a tall layered cake decorated with icing flowers that matched the garden blooms. A flower shop arranged centerpieces on every table. The small hardware store brought extra strings of lights to drape across the porch railings. Their contributions gave the event the feel of a neighborhood fair, vibrant and welcoming. Guided house tours began at noon. Groups of 10 at a time stepped inside to see the intricate woodwork and stained glass panels. Harold, the retired city planner, led the first group, pointing out original fixtures and the carefully preserved banister. Guests admired the vintage tiles in the foyer and the detailed crown molding in the parlor. Children pressed close to the windows to catch the colored light from the stained glass. Every room told a story, and visitors took pictures to share with friends who couldn't attend. In the middle of the afternoon, I spotted my parents near the back garden. My father lingered by the stone fountain, watching a group of children chase bubbles across the lawn. When I approached, he admitted he hadn't realized how important the house was to so many people. He said the turnout and the interest from city officials made him think selling might be a mistake. His words were quiet but clear over the music and chatter around us. My mother stood a few feet away, polite but distant. She spoke with neighbors when approached, but kept her expression tight and her responses brief. She listened as people shared memories of past gatherings in the garden, but never added a story of her own. Throughout the day, longtime residents took turns at the small microphone to share memories. One neighbor described weddings held under the old maple trees. Another recalled neighborhood watch meetings on the porch decades ago. Someone produced a black and white photo from the 1950s showing children playing in the same yard. Each story deepened the sense of connection between the house and the community. By early evening, a local newspaper reporter arrived to cover the scene. She interviewed neighbors and city officials, photographed the banner at the gate, and promised a follow-up feature for the Sunday edition. The energy in the garden stayed high as the sun began to set, strings of lights casting a warm glow over the crowd. Just before the band packed up, one of the preservation board members gathered a few key people to share news. They announced that because of the overwhelming public support and the detailed documentation already provided, the board would fast-track the landmark vote. Instead of waiting months, they planned to hold the formal hearing within a few weeks. Applause and cheers spread across the garden as neighbors hugged and clapped each other on the back. As people began to leave, a neighbor mentioned that a developer who had once expressed interest in the property had officially withdrawn. The notice came through a local real estate agent, who had heard about the pending designation and the level of neighborhood involvement. The possibility of a quick sale to an outside buyer had effectively ended. Mara used the moment to reinforce the legal side. She drafted a formal letter to my parents' attorney that evening, stating my tenant rights and citing the pending historic status. The letter also noted that any attempt to sell during the protective period would violate city regulations. Meanwhile, neighbors organized a rotating watch schedule. Volunteers signed up for evening and early morning patrols to ensure that no one tried to trespass or tamper with the property. They set up a shared group chat to report anything unusual, and planned to keep it active until the Preservation Board issued its final decision. Before the night ended, several families offered financial help in case legal fees became necessary. They pledged small donations, explaining that protecting the home benefited the entire neighborhood. One family promised to cover the cost of additional security lights. Another offered to pay for a professional archivist to document the home's history. As the crowd thinned, my father stayed behind. He walked the garden path slowly, looking at the freshly planted beds and the illuminated porch. When we paused near the gate, he admitted again that he was reconsidering the sale. He said the day had shown him how much the house meant, not only to me, but to the entire community. When the last guests left and the music faded, I stood on the porch surrounded by empty coffee cups and scattered flower petals. The festival had transformed a quiet street into a statement of unity and purpose. Neighbors had rallied, officials had pledged support, and the Preservation Board had promised swift action. My mother's silence and my father's quiet change of heart hung in the cool evening air, but the message of the day was unmistakable. The house was no longer just a private matter. I gathered the signed guest list, donation pledges, and extra petitions, adding them to the growing file of evidence for the upcoming hearing. Every document, every photograph, every story told during the festival strengthened the case for keeping the house protected. With the board moving faster than expected, and the community more united than ever, the path forward was set. As night settled over the neighborhood, the lights along the porch railings flickered softly. The garden, still fragrant from a day of activity, felt alive with the echo of voices and music. Surrounded by a stack of papers and the quiet support of an entire street, I knew the fight to preserve the house had reached a new and powerful stage. 2 days after the festival, a letter from the City Preservation Board arrived confirming an official hearing for the historic designation in just 2 weeks. The date and time were printed in bold across the top, and the notice stated that all parties with an interest in the property were invited to attend. Neighbors stopped by that evening to congratulate me and marked the date on their calendars. The next morning, a courier delivered a thick envelope with my mother's handwriting on the outside, but a law firm's logo in the corner. Inside was a formal eviction notice from an attorney I didn't recognize. It demanded that I vacate the property within 30 days, claiming I had no legal right to remain. The letter ignored the city's temporary hold on any sale or eviction, while the historic application was under review. I called Mara as soon as I read it. By noon, she had filed a counter-response, attaching proof of the city's protective order and a copy of the petition already accepted by the Preservation Board. She emailed the attorney a formal notice that any attempt to remove me before the hearing violated city regulations. That evening, my father came by alone. He walked the garden in slow circles before suggesting we try mediation to avoid more conflict. He said a neutral party might help everyone reach an agreement. I agreed to attend if my mother wanted it, but when he raised the idea to her later that night, she refused. 2 days later, the city council member who had attended the festival issued a public statement supporting the landmark proposal. She posted it on her official website and sent it to the local newspaper, highlighting the neighborhood's effort and the cultural value of the house. Neighbors printed the statement and taped it to community bulletin boards and shop windows. Letters poured in to the preservation board from residents across the neighborhood. Dozens of people described holiday gatherings, weddings, and community meetings that had taken place in the garden over the years. Some enclosed photos showing the house decorated for past festivals or lit up for winter celebrations. Local television soon picked up the story. A camera crew arrived one afternoon to film the garden and record short interviews with longtime residents. They aired a segment on the evening news featuring footage from the festival and an interview with the council member. Viewers across the city saw the banners, the green ribbons, and the steady support for the historic application. Meanwhile, the financial side of the process became clearer. A real estate consultant explained on air that a landmark designation would reduce the property's market value and make redevelopment nearly impossible. My father watched the report with me during a quiet visit. My mother, however, grew even more frustrated, leaving sharp voicemail messages insisting that I withdraw the petition. Support came from unexpected places. My aunt called after seeing the television segment and offered to testify at the hearing about my years of paying utilities and funding repairs. She promised to bring receipts and photographs of earlier family gatherings at the house. Reports of a suspicious car slowly circling the block several nights in a row pushed neighbors to add extra security. Volunteers installed motion lights and small cameras on porches facing the street. They set up a group text to share updates and arranged a nightly patrol rotation to keep watch until the hearing. Late one evening, my mother called again, demanding that I drop the petition or face what she called a long legal war. I listened without comment and documented the call immediately afterward for Mara's records. The strain on my parents' marriage became more visible. My father began spending nights at a friend's house to escape the constant arguments. Neighbors noticed he came by alone to check on the garden and talk quietly with me about the upcoming hearing. He never openly sided with me, but he no longer spoke about selling the property. The next neighborhood association meeting drew twice the usual crowd. Folding chairs filled every corner of the community center as residents reviewed the timeline for the hearing and discussed how to present the strongest possible case. Volunteers signed up to write additional letters, gather more signatures, and attend the hearing in person. A few days later, one of the preservation board members stopped by while walking a dog and spoke briefly at the gate. She said the documentation and community support were impressive and that the case for historic status looked strong. She encouraged me to keep every receipt, photo, and written statement organized for the hearing. Mara and I spent the following week compiling a master binder of evidence. We sorted every receipt for roof repairs, garden expenses, and utility payments. We labeled photographs showing the property's unique features and arranged letters of support in chronological order. Harold helped create a timeline that matched city ordinances to each piece of documentation. We added a printed copy of the council member's public statement and the newspaper articles covering the festival. By the end of the week, the binder was 3 inches thick and neatly tabbed by section: financial contributions, historical significance, community support, and legal filings. We made multiple copies for the board, the city council, and for legal backup in case my mother's attorney tried another maneuver. As the hearing date approached, neighbors checked in daily. Some offered to drive elderly residents to City Hall so they could attend. Others prepared posters and banners to display outside the building. The sense of unity deepened with each passing day, and the upcoming hearing became the main topic at every local shop and cafe. Despite the tension with my mother, the preparations stayed focused and practical. The house remained well cared for, with fresh flowers planted along the walkway and the porch lights glowing each night. The motion cameras captured only friendly faces and the occasional raccoon, but the neighborhood patrol continued its quiet rounds. 2 weeks after the festival, the garden was again filled with neighbors as we reviewed final plans for the hearing. The green ribbons had faded a little under the sun, but they still lined every mailbox on the block. The house stood as solid and welcoming as ever, ready for the next step in the fight to secure its future. The morning of the hearing arrived cool and bright, with a thin mist lifting off the street as neighbors gathered outside the city hall. Green ribbons fluttered from car antennas and handbags. By the time I reached the chamber, every seat was filled and people lined the hallway walls. The buzz of conversation carried through the open doors while reporters adjusted cameras and tripods near the back. The preservation board sat behind a long oak table at the front of the room. A clerk read the agenda, listing the historic designation of my family home as the first item. When my name was called, I stepped to the podium with a binder of documents and a stack of photographs. I began by presenting a timeline of financial contributions I had made over the years: utility payments, roof repairs, garden renovations, each backed by receipts and bank records. Large photos of the house's architectural details appeared on a screen beside the podium: the stained glass windows, hand-carved porch columns, and century-old maple trees. I explained how these features matched early 20th century design standards and how the property had been a center for community gatherings for decades. Neighbors followed with their testimonies. Mrs. Dalton described annual garden parties that brought together families across the neighborhood. Mr. Dulwich Ruiz spoke of neighborhood watch meetings that began on the porch years ago. An elderly couple shared how their wedding reception had taken place under the same maple trees. Each account painted a vivid picture of the house as more than just a private residence. It was a shared landmark of local history. When it was my mother's turn, she walked to the podium with her attorney and a folder of her own. She stated firmly that the house was private property purchased with her and my father's money, and that she had every right to sell it. She argued that I was interfering with their retirement plans and using community sympathy to block a legitimate sale. Her attorney added that landmark status would lower the property value and restrict their financial options. The room grew quiet when my father unexpectedly rose to speak. He walked to the podium without looking at my mother. He talked about the home's generational importance and how it represented the hard work of our grandparents. He said he had watched the neighborhood rally and realized the house carried more than personal value. It held the shared memories of many families. He ended by saying he believed preservation was the right path forward. Board members began their questions. They asked my mother why she had rejected my earlier offer to sign a formal rental agreement and pay market rent. They pressed about her refusal to consider mediation and noted the extensive community support for historic designation. My mother repeated that the property was hers to control, but her answers grew shorter as the board members examined the documentation I had provided. Mara stepped to the podium to outline the legal standing of my tenancy. She presented evidence of my financial role in maintaining the property and explained that the pending historic application already required a hold on any sale or eviction. Her clear explanation drew nods from several board members. The crowd responded warmly when a neighbor recounted decades of community festivals held in the garden. Applause filled the chamber as another resident described the house as a living piece of neighborhood history. The board chair called for order but smiled as she did so. After the testimonies and questions, the board announced a short recess to deliberate. Conversations broke out across the room while reporters approached neighbors for quick interviews. 15 minutes later, the board returned and the chair read their decision. The vote was unanimous. The property would receive historic landmark status, effective immediately. Any sale or structural changes would require city approval from that day forward. A collective cheer rose from the audience. My mother stood abruptly, gathered her folder, and left the chamber without speaking. My father remained behind, walked over to me, and quietly thanked me for protecting the family legacy. Cameras flashed as neighbors hugged and congratulated one another. Outside City Hall, the celebration continued. Residents gathered on the steps, clapping and cheering while reporters recorded statements. Plans for a weekend gathering in my garden formed on the spot, with offers of food, music, and decorations. The following morning, a city official arrived at the house with a bronze plaque engraved with the landmark designation. He mounted it on the front gate while a small group of neighbors watched. Someone snapped a photo and sent it to the local paper, which published it online within the hour. Later that day, an email from a real estate agent confirmed that the last developer who had shown interest in the property had officially withdrawn. The historic status and the public attention left no path for redevelopment. Throughout the week, neighbors dropped by with baked goods and congratulations. They thanked me for standing firm and for organizing the documents and petitions that made the designation possible. Harold brought a framed copy of the newspaper article covering the hearing and suggested it hang in the hallway as a reminder of the effort. Mara helped me organize the next steps. We updated the property's records with the city and set up a maintenance plan that aligned with preservation guidelines. Volunteers from the gardening club signed up for seasonal projects, from repainting trim to cataloging the unique plants in the yard. My father visited again on Saturday. He walked through the garden, now filled with fresh blossoms from the recent plantings, and talked about setting up a clear payment plan for taxes and utilities so everything would remain transparent. He mentioned inviting my mother to future family discussions once she was ready, though he admitted she might need time. As evening fell, neighbors gathered once more, this time to toast the official recognition of the house. Lanterns lit the pathways, and children played near the fountain. Conversations buzzed with ideas for upcoming preservation projects around the neighborhood. Standing near the new plaque, I listened as friends discussed plans for future festivals and historical tours. The house was no longer just a family property, it had become a recognized part of the city's heritage and a center for community activity. The legal fight had ended, but the responsibility of maintaining the home and its history had only begun. When the crowd finally dispersed and the lights dimmed, I walked the garden path, noticing how the landmark plaque caught the glow of the porch light. The house stood solid and quiet, protected for generations to come. With the neighborhood's support and the city's official recognition, the next chapter of caring for the home and whatever came next for my family was ready to unfold. The Saturday after the board's decision, the garden turned into a celebration space. Tables covered in checkered cloth stretched across the lawn, filled with homemade pies, fresh bread, and bowls of colorful salads. Strings of lights hung from the maple branches, and a small stage stood near the fountain where a local folk trio tuned their instruments. Neighbors arrived carrying dishes and flowers until the yard overflowed with laughter and music. Children darted between the flower beds while adults set up extra chairs along the porch. A city council member who had championed the landmark designation stepped onto the stage mid-afternoon. She held a framed certificate and spoke about the value of preserving history and the strength of community action. When she handed me the certificate, neighbors clapped and whistled, and someone rang a small bell that had hung by the garden gate for decades. Cameras flashed as the council member posed for photos with families who had signed the petition months earlier. Late in the day, my father arrived quietly through the side gate. He walked across the lawn, greeting a few neighbors before finding me near the porch steps. Away from the crowd, he admitted he should have listened earlier and thanked me for protecting the house. He said the hearing opened his eyes to what the home meant to so many people and promised to help with whatever came next. My mother chose not to attend. Instead, she sent a brief message through my aunt saying she needed time to process everything. My aunt passed along the note and stayed for the rest of the evening, helping serve food and chatting with neighbors. During the celebration, several neighbors proposed a plan to share seasonal upkeep. They drew up a schedule for tasks like clearing leaves, repainting trim, and tending the larger garden beds. Volunteers signed their names beside each task so no one person would carry the full load. A few even offered to bring tools and ladders for future repairs. Mara arrived with a manila envelope containing the official paperwork from the Preservation Board. The documents confirmed that the landmark status was permanent and that no major alteration or sale could occur without city approval. We filed the papers in the house's record folder and shared copies with the city clerk for public records. Later that week, my father and I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and calculator to plan finances. We listed property taxes, utilities, and regular maintenance costs, then divided them in a way that kept everything transparent and balanced. We agreed on a shared account to cover recurring bills and set reminders for quarterly reviews, so nothing slipped through the cracks. A few days after the celebration, an email arrived from the local historical society inviting me to consult on upcoming preservation projects. They had followed the story in the news and were impressed by how the neighborhood organized. They asked if I would share the process we used, from collecting signatures to preparing legal documents, to help other communities protect their own historic properties. The local newspaper printed a full-page feature on the event, complete with photos of the garden festival, the landmark plaque, and quotes from neighbors about the importance of protecting neighborhood heritage. Copies sold out at the corner shop, and several residents framed the article to hang in their homes. Inspired by the victory, the gardening club announced a new project, converting a nearby vacant lot into a public flower garden. They scheduled planning meetings and asked me to advise on layout and plant selection. Donations of seeds and soil poured in within days, and a local hardware store promised to supply benches and planters. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of daily life settled back into place. My father suggested that we consider professional mediation for future family decisions to prevent conflicts like the one we had just faced. I agreed, and we began researching mediators recommended by friends and the community center. Not long after, my mother began making occasional phone calls. At first, she only asked about birthdays or small household details, but the conversations grew slightly longer each time. She avoided the subject of the house, but the calls themselves felt like a slow step toward easing the tension. Neighbors continued to drop by with small gifts, fresh bread, gardening tips, even old photos of the house from past festivals. Afternoon visits on the porch became routine, reinforcing a network of mutual care that had strengthened during the fight for preservation. One evening, I walked the garden path at dusk. The landmark plaque on the gate caught the last light of the setting sun, glowing softly as the porch lights flickered on. The garden, freshly mulched and bright with late blooms, stretched around me, alive with the quiet hum of crickets. The house stood as it had for generations, secure and protected, a testament to the community that rallied to save it and the lessons learned about standing firm and working together. The struggle had reshaped more than just the property. It had drawn neighbors closer, clarified family roles, and set a plan for the future. As night settled over the street, I paused at the gate and looked back at the lights shining through the stained glass, knowing that the home, and the people who fought for it, would remain part of this neighborhood story for many years to come.